Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at the 1996 Pinnacle baseball set. This set, I originally was going to do this as a two-set look at both 1996 Pinnacle and Aficionado, but I came to realize there's way too much to talk about with 1996 Pinnacle because Pinnacle was going through kind of a transitional phase of transitioning from, in 1995, they finally kind of figured out what they were. And they were starting to move forward with that, but they were still kind of playing around with establishing exactly how it was all going to work. And 96 was both playing around with that, but also exploring how much they could get away with. It was the same year when Topps started doing Topps Chrome, and Pinnacle wanted to do kind of something similar, which is kind of weird because Collector's Edge had already done in 94 and 95 some experiments with doing multiple releases of a set, and it wasn't the smartest move that they made, but both Topps and Pinnacle wanted to kind of play around with it. So that adds a little bit of a wrinkle to the 1996 Pinnacle release. But thankfully for baseball, it wasn't as bad as over in football. So there were more than one releases for Pinnacle, which I'll get to in a minute. But first off, the design comes down to the fact that for Pinnacle, in 1994, they started doing different designs for all of the sports, which is weird because in Score, in 1993, they just pulled all of the designs together into one place. But in 94, Pinnacle took a different approach for baseball than they did for football. And baseball was kind of a free-form affair, whereas football was obviously much more rigid and an attempt at crafting a very clear design. 94 was kind of weird because they had a big gold foil Pinnacle at the bottom of the card that was overpowering, but in 95 they really cleaned it up and made one of the all-time great cards. The only problem was it was such a great design that they discovered that actually Upper Deck did the exact same thing, and so Pinnacle discovered itself, or found itself looking at having the same design as a competitor, so they weren't distinct. So for 1996, they needed to do something that was distinct. And over in baseball, it was all kind of loose and freeform. So for 1996, they chose to pull everything together and once again do the same design across all three sports. And the model that they went with was to pull kind of the mentality of what they were doing in football into the design. So the 1996 design was kind of a blend of the previous 2 years, where it was almost a full bleed card, three-quarter bleed card that was very heavily image forward. That was really the whole point, where they were trying to make the image be the dominant element on the card. And then they took the gold foil Pinnacle and they made a reduced version of it that didn't take up too much of the presence of the card, but they also pulled a little bit of their baseball design in by bringing in some of the dufects right onto every single card. So right down at the bottom, you got a baseball player silhouette that's swinging and making contact, and then the explosion that they had on that part was coming off of the baseball bat. So the design that they had for Pinnacle was a hybrid of what they'd been making in the previous years, but for 96, like I said, it was across the board the same design. Interesting design on the bottom of the card. The card back's very nice, but it didn't really have the spirit that we'd seen in 1995, at least in football, and to an extent in the baseball release in 95 as well. But like I said, there was more than one release, and so they had their basic Pinnacle release, but they also had a foil release. Separate packs, and the foil release is, basically it's the same set, except everything on the card back is the same, and everything at the bottom of the card is the same. It's just that the image of the player is in foil, or has a foil finish over it, as opposed to the regular glossy image on the main cards. So that's the only difference. But it's not a parallel, it's a separate release. And I distinguish that because parallels are in the same packs with the cards, and they did exactly that as we had been seeing with their museum collection, but in 1996 they called it their Starburst cards. And these cards are the same approach, where the whole card is a dufex finish on from the top to bottom. The whole thing is dufex. And they have the explosion of the effect in the background is rays coming out of the Pinnacle logo. On the card back, they have just a little Starburst emblem down at the bottom. And that is basically the difference of the Starburst cards. Except there is one very distinct thing about these, which is that they are not, it's not the entire set, it's half of the set. So the set is Series 1, Series 2, 200 cards for 400 total, but the Starburst set is 100 cards and 100 cards, so it's 200 cards, meaning that half of the cards in the set are done with the parallel, not 400, and instead of doing a skip number, they renumbered the cards, so it's a whole nother range of cards that essentially needs its own checklist. So half the players half of the cards in the set have parallels, half of them do not. And in the rest of the set, they do have rookies, which are only distinguished because the player name is in red. And then on the back there is a rookie logo. That's the only difference. So they didn't do anything special for the rookies, but they did have 3 subsets. And the first subset is the Natural. And the Naturals set is, so this is a lot more akin to the 1995 Pinnacle set. It's got a really nice design element that has a nice flow, has a really great logo, and it has a really formal, elegant look to it that makes these cards look fantastic. Excellent set. But what's really fun is that when you look at the parallel cards, for those cards that do have parallels, here the whole radiance comes not from the Pinnacle logo, but out from the baseball on the logo for the Naturals, and it radiates out across the rest of the card. Looks really, really nice. And then they have another subset called Hardball Heroes. And this is a card that's very angular in its design. It has an interesting element where they have the baseball seam in a line along one of the angles, which is a cool little idea. And even though it's very angular and boxy, the card really does have a strong design aesthetic to it. But I think this is a good time to mention that there are, as you would expect, 2 parallels of the cards. So Starburst, of course, is the basic parallel. And then as they like to do, they took a version of that where they added an artist proof logo on it. But in the case of 1996, the logo is actually not one logo, but it's a whole bunch of diagonal lines of text across the background of the card. Not covering it, but they show up in a number of places. So instead of looking for a specific place to see the artist proof logo, you got to look at the whole background and see where it's showing up on there. And that's the way that they did that particular version of the card. But again, like I said before, half of the cards in the set have the parallels, and any card that has a Starburst also has an artist proof. So either a card has no parallels or it has 2 parallels. So there's either one version of it or 3 versions of it in the main release packs. And then they have one more subset, which is the 300 cards or 300 club. This is for players who batted 300 or more. And each one of these cards is designed in a horizontal format with a band down one side with gold foil, and it has the Dufex in it where it radiates out from the team logo. But every single one of these cards has the particular player's batting average on it. And it's to 4 digits, so you can see here it's .3053, that's his batting average. And the whole point of this card is actually really cool because you get the idea that these guys are the leaders in the batting average, but every single player has the batting average. If you reduce it to 3, that becomes the card number. So if you're batting 300, it's card number 300. If your batting average is 323, the player's card shows up at card number 323. So that means once you get to 300, you have the cards are interspersed amongst the first half of the 300 card range. So they're set up wherever their batting average shows up, which is great, except in this case, you'll notice that, well, both of these guys have batted 305. One's 305.3, the other's 305.6. And so the way that Pinnacle worked that was they are both card number 305. Now, instead of being 305A and 305B, they're 305.3 and 305.6, which, works perfectly well, but it's an interesting quirk in this set that they have 2 305s, but it's still a 200 card Series 2 set. So instead of having a card 400, they ended the set at 399. So they still have 400 cards in the complete set, but they're 2 cards that show up with the same card number. So if you're putting these in binder pages, you got to understand once you get past 305, the end of the, you can't rely on double checking your work by making sure that the end of every page is a card ending in some derivative of 9. All of a sudden it shifts by 1 simply because the rest of the set after 305, it shows up 1 number later. So understand there's no card number 400 because card number 400 is actually another 305. Really interesting, but that's the way they did the set. But I do have to note that the starburst parallel of these cards looks so cool. It's got a really neat radial pattern arrayed all around the player. And then over on the side, instead of having any sort of array in the gold foil box, it has kind of like a fade of, and a really cool effect. Just kind of a wave going through it, which is a really neat approach for these cards. So these do look really cool. And then the set does have one special card which is honoring the very, very notable success of the farm team for the LA Dodgers, which for 4 years running had, shall we say, proven very good at their rookies being called up, the success that they had year after year. So here are all 4 of their star rookies over the last 4 years. And so they got this card. And then each of the sets ends with checklists, which have a player on the front and then checklist on the back. And that brings the whole set to a close. Now, they did do a bunch of inserts, but I'll get to that in a second because 1996 was the big year for Cal Ripken Jr.'s record-setting streak. The streak was still going on, but he'd finally broken Lou Gehrig's record of consecutive games. And just about everybody got in on the action, including Pinnacle, so they had an SP card honoring that with not a card with Dufex, but a card with a whole bunch of holofoil on it. It is kind of an interesting card, but it sure does lack the spirit of what Pinnacle was doing, especially when you see the inserts that they did, because this was definitely a year where they were having fun with designs, a lot of fun with designs. So in the inserts, we kick it off with a card that is about as straightforward as you're going to see from Pinnacle, which is the Christy Brinkley collection. And this is a card set where, so Christy Brinkley was a major model in the 1980s and somewhat in the 1990s too. But she had really taken up photography. So she did a photo shoot with members of the Cleveland Indians and the Atlanta Braves. And so this is a card set where you see shots that she took from a photo shoot she did with a bunch of players. On the front is one of those pictures, and on the back is a 1996 equivalent of a selfie with her and whoever she had photographed for that particular card. So that was the way the card set was done, and again, it's just Cleveland Indians and Atlanta Braves. Then they have a set called Essence of the Game, and these cards are acetate. So basically it's a picture of the player, and then it's clear on either side with some stars around. And then up at the top is a whole box, kind of like a turned version of the 300 cards. Whole box at the top with holofoil on it, with kind of an effect on it that's not the most impressive effect, but it's a card that definitely stands out. This would be one of the gold standard cards for just about any other 1996 set. But for the inserts for 96 Pinnacle, as you're going to see, this isn't as impressive as I'd like to think. And a great place to see that is when we shift over to the first rate cards. Here you can see that, man, they were having some fun with Dufex. This whole card surface is done in Dufex, but you can see they're playing a few tricks. So they have that same spiral effect that we saw on the 300 cards. That is going on behind the player, which just looks really impressive on these cards. And then you have the band on the side, almost like this is a vertical version of the 300 cards, and the band has one Dufex effect for the text, and then it has a really impressive free-form Dufex behind that, which looks more like the kind of thing you see on a lenticular card. Here they're doing it with Dufex, which is a really cool effect, making this card a wonderful exploration of a whole bunch of different brushed metal effects that you can do with the Dufex, and so the card just has a really fun spirit to it. Then they have their Pinnacle Power cards. And the Pinnacle Power cards, so This card, following what we just saw, isn't quite as effective as it would normally be because it's got a matte finish around the outside. All the black is matte finish, making the gold foil stand out more. And then all they have is holofoil, but the spectral effect of the holofoil has a very dynamic spirit to it that does look really pretty cool. And in any other case, this would be a standout card. Again, like Essence, only this is a lot better than Essence, but it is kind of buried in this Dufex fest, which actually brings me to the next set, which is the Prospect Stardom cards. And these cards, once again, we're back to Dufex, because it's like every time you step away from Dufex, you got to go back to it. And here, what they're playing around with is a radial pattern around a portrait of the player, and they have both inward and outward effects on the Dufex on the card, giving it a very interesting, lively quality to it, as well as Dufex for the action shot of the player. But for the portrait, it's not Dufex, it's a different effect. It's more of a chrome effect. So while everything on the card is kind of a fun playing around with all the effects, the image, the portrait, actually pops up in a whole different way. So the card has a cool experiential spirit to it. That is what makes Dufex really, really cool. The Dufex cards, you got to play around with them. That's just kind of the way that it is. And then the hardest card to come by, the most popular card, is Skylines. And the thing about Skylines is, once again, it's an acetate card. In this case, it's like a horizontal version of the Essence of the Game card, only this is a much better card. They still have the band up at the top with, in this case, 2 different spectral effects for the holofoil. Portrait of the player, space behind them, but then you have a wonderful skyline down below that heads up into the openness of the sky. This is a card that is really cool. It looks great, and that's the big reason why it's so popular. It is a rare card to get in packs, but it's such a cool card. It stands out amongst pretty much everything in the 90s. Definitely one of the most distinct cards. Very, very cool. But once again, we stepped away from Dufex, so it's time to get back to it. And boy, are we going to get back to it, because Slugfest is a card that is unapologetically Dufex. This thing is overly done. So here's the thing. With Dufex cards, it's usually a very fine, subtle satin-like finish, and it just looks great. The problem with these cards is that it's so overpowering that it makes the card difficult to see in most ways, in which case you really got to play around with it and appreciate the powerful quality of the Dufex effect that's built into the card. This is one of those cards that absolutely does not make sense in a slab, because it really does need to, in order to appreciate it, it really does need to be in your hand. You really do need to play around with it. And it is really cool, but it is, wow, it is pretty surprising, I'll say that. Considering all the way that all Dufex cards come across, this one comes out in a different way. Not a problem, but it just doesn't look as good in a straightforward fashion as we do with others. And it is Pinnacle, so of course they have Team Pinnacle, and like with just about every single Team Pinnacle ever made, player on the front, player on the back. Now, at this period, they had Dufex in the front and they had a chrome finish on the back. That's just the way that they approached their Team Pinnacle cards. There are some cases where they have 2 versions of each card. They have the Dufex on the front and chrome on the back, or chrome on the front and Dufex on the back. In this case, there's only one version, the Dufex on the front, chrome on the back. I have not found any record that shows that they had them in reverse. I've never seen one in reverse, so I believe there's only one version of each one of these cards. But here we go. This is Team Pinnacle for 1996. And then they have Team Spirit, and Team Spirit follows along with the Pinnacle Power cards. It has a black matte finish around the outside. Not a lot of gold foil to work with it, but they have a hollow foil on it where they have a kind of a deconstructed baseball, which is an interesting idea. And again, in just about any other set, this would be a card that would be a big standout. In this case, it's about the low point of all the cards. It's a nice enough card, but with all of the different creativity that we were seeing with these cards, it is kind of surprising that this doesn't have more energy to it. And once again, we're away from the Dufex, so we got to get back to it. And so Team Tomorrow is the final card for all of the inserts. And in this case, it has a very simple setup of just kind of a 4-point rotation of light coming off of a center point. But it has a wonderful sunset behind the players, which make these cards, while they're not dynamic, they're very impressive in terms of just being a cool card. That's really all that it needs to be. It reads beautifully. And that was the card set. But it's not everything to say about Pinnacle in 1996, because Pinnacle, Score and Pinnacle, during this time, they were the big company doing FanFest cards. And for 1996, at FanFest, they released cards for FanFest. These cards are, so they have the gold foil at the bottom, but behind the player, they have black and white images of 2 Philadelphia scenes. Philadelphia is where FanFest was occurring. And so because it's black and white and not really a full image, the player who is in full color stands out a lot more on these cards, making these very player forward, which is a really nice quality to these cards. But not every single one of these cards, because being in Philadelphia, they wanted to do one thing different in this card set, and Darren Dalton was the star of the Phillies at the time. So card number 30 is actually an SP card that is done differently. It's done as a lenticular card. So this one card is done in a lenticular fashion, and it definitely is distinct, but it's also about the end of the road for Pinnacle doing lenticular cards. So this is a nice little, it's a part of the final hurrah for essentially for Sportflix. But that's not all that came with the story of FanFest, because they also did a number of special promo cards for different people who were involved with the event. So there's a whole series of cards, not a big series, just a handful, but a number of cards that were done for different individuals who were not really a part of the sport per se. And each one of these cards, there's no gold foil on it. It's very simplistic. The card stock is more like an early 90s score stock. So just a basic card, just kind of cranked out. And none of these cards are numbered either, because they were handed out. They weren't intended to be a part of a set. But there's one other thing to mention about FanFest, which is that the cards in the main set can be found in another way, which is in playing card style. So the cards came with same height, but they're narrower with the rounded corners. They're essentially the size of a playing card. And on the card back, they have the Pinnacle logo. These do not have gold foil. In fact, the surface of the front of the card is not even really a matte. It's more what you would call a satin finish in terms of photo creations. So these cards are very unusual to come by, but this is another way that the FanFest cards came. And we are finally able to bring 1996 Pinnacle to a close. Like I said, originally I wanted to do Aficionado as a part of this because I thought it would be a good lineup. But as you can see, we've already been going on for a long time because, unfortunately, there's a lot to say about the 1996 Pinnacle set. So I'll be doing Aficionado, I don't know, I'll need to tack that onto something else. So that'll be a completely different video. And 1997, I'll eventually get around to that. But there again, there are 2 different Pinnacle sets for 1997, so that's going to be a complex one. It's going to be a little bit of work for me to put together the rest of Pinnacle, because they were getting kind of scattered and kind of running adrift. In fact, we were getting close to the end of Pinnacle, which is a shame because they did amazing work, but they couldn't really line things up. And, we can see a little bit of that here with a set, but it is a shame because, man, Dufex, so awesome. So that brings this video to a close. Now, if you have not subscribed to my channel, I do urge you to do so. Definitely check out my other videos if you haven't had a chance. I've done everything for the run-up through Pinnacle. I've also done all of Pinnacle in football if you want to check that out. So other than that, thank you for watching.